Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Architecture Foundation Book Week 2023. And a huge pleasure to be able to welcome John Tuomey from O'Donnell and Tuomey Architects, who's written the most fantastic book. I enjoyed it so much. I know John's writing about architecture in the past, but this is something quite special. First Quarter, which is an architect's autobiography, very much an autobiography about the formation of an architect, although very emphatically not a book about the entirety of John's career. It's really focusing on the first 25 years of his life and talking about the kind of formation of both his own identity and his identity as an architect. John, I know this is a lockdown project. Perhaps you could explain a little bit about the kind of gestation of it. Well, was this something you'd been meaning to do for a while, and the opportunity had presented itself, or was it an immediate response to changed circumstances?
Well, I'm talking to you from my stair landing in my house, where I was confined for, how long were we? Well over a year anyway. And I was working on this, restricted space. And the strange thing about lockdown, you all might remember, is that it's very hard to divide home life from work life if you're locked in your home on your own all the time. Sheila's down on the ground floor and I'm up at the top of the house. So I got an email one night, one of these days when you don't know it's a night or day. I got an email from my younger sister who asked me in the email about what it was like before she was born, because my father, being a site engineer, we moved house many times until the time I was 10. And my sister, there's about a 10-year difference, and she just asked a question about that. So, late one night, I wrote her an email about what I could begin to remember about places that I'd sort of forgotten about. And it was an easy email to answer, but the funny thing is just the sentences. I wrote a little bit and then I kind of said, this is interesting. So just a haphazard connection with my sister got me going. And I don't know, you get into a kind of I know this from designing, that you get into a kind of flow, one thought leads to another. But I hadn't really written before except about our projects or about our way of working or something. So maybe I had the uninterrupted time in the evenings and was nowhere to go. So I got started. And if this isn't too much information, I was asked to do a talk at a conference, at a regular architects conference in Newman House in the centre of Dublin, Stephen's Green, to colleagues who I've been teaching with, for all my life. And they asked would I do a paper about poetry and architecture. And, I can kind of do that. I wrote a paper about what I thought might be a relationship between poetics and architecture and poetics. And I agreed to give this talk. But the woman who was organizing the event, Ellen Rowley, architectural historian, said to me, well, by the way, the name of the conference is Architecture and Its Stories. Would you have anything else you might contribute to that? And I said, well, I am kind of thinking about my childhood. And Ellen said, well, how did you, read a bit of the conference in a separate part of the conference. So I came in day one at the conference and I gave my keynote, about architecture and poetry lecture. I know, fine, no problem. I came in the second day to do my 15-minute slot from my, childhood. Same audience, same podium, same place. And I kind of realized this is not what I'm used to. I know you a long time, Ellis, and I can turn up in a room with 1,000 people in it and talk about a project without thinking about it. But I was, shaking because I was talking about when I was 7 or when I was 6 or whatever. So then I thought maybe I should continue this beyond the childhood of what my sister had asked me about. I got stoked up about it, and people said to me that maybe you should keep going. So isn't it amazing? A tiny drop of encouragement, like a chemical reaction. Step out of lockdown, meet 50 people, and then I set to work, and then I put it together, and now we have a book. Yeah, unexpected. I didn't know it was coming. Yeah,
and it's as a genre, the architect's autobiography. There's not too many examples one can think of, but I always do feel that they have the potential to get to places that conventional art history doesn't. And through my job, I know a lot of architects and a lot of good architects, and it always strikes me that all the good ones, the work is kind of rooted in a very personal idea of how the world might be, and often I sort of feel that they kind of fall into two camps, that they're either the ones who are iconoclasts, who are in rebellion against the circumstances in which they grew up, or they're architects, maybe like Lutyens, with a deep nostalgia for a kind of a world that perhaps has passed. And that's difficult territory. What makes an architect tick? That's difficult territory for an architectural historian to go near without becoming a kind of cod psychologist. But I think your book absolutely it does begin to answer some of those questions about what the core motivations are behind the work that you've made, subsequent to the narrative of the book. Are there other architectural autobiographies biographies that have meant something to you, that were kind of models in this?
No, not really. I haven't really been a great biography reader. I read novels. That's my default. If I'm sitting around in an evening, I read a novel or poetry. But to be honest, I haven't read many biographies. I think I've read Lutyens, all right. But I suppose I should do. No, it wasn't modeled on a biography. It was, I was thinking about structuring it linearly from first memory, from black and white to color, you know what I mean? And then after the first draft, I thought, no, you should change. But you should change because you have to think what you were thinking then and how it relates to what you're thinking now. But I definitely didn't want to go into a career summary. I didn't want to say, and the next thing and the next thing I did, and the next, I didn't want it to be like that. So I thought I'll stop it when I started with Sheila. I'll stop the book when I started working with Sheila. So it's kind of, pre-formation, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, the one that actually sprung to mind as a sort of similar structure was Max Fry's autobiographical sketches, which takes his story up to when he marries Jane Drew.
Oh, really? I don't know that book at all. Yeah.
Having recently just completed a biography of an architect myself, I was conscious that the battle you're always facing as a writer is avoiding the then and then and then aspect of a kind of telling a linear narrative. And I think you've constructed that just brilliantly. Yes, you're looking at this 25 years, but always bouncing back and forth to things that you wouldn't have known at the time. As I say, there's a number of kind of preoccupations that emerge in your childhood that knowing the buildings, one does want to know how those preoccupations have sort of resonated through the architectural work. I guess one obvious one is landscape as a sort of concern that's there from the very beginning. Yeah. As you referred to your kind of quite itinerant childhood up until the age of 10, but I think landscape and nature and latterly archaeology become kind of concerns for you before you know you're going to be an architect. And those are obviously topics which a building like the Lyric in Belfast is just steeped in that sort of imagination of the land.
Well, I think, I feel like I was torn out of the countryside and brought into the town, if you know what I mean. Because I think on those journeys that my parents were doing from Kerry to Leitrim to Cork to Louth to wherever, I think I always thought we'd be going back somehow to Kerry. I thought we were just on an outing, and I was at, it's funny, my younger siblings, when my parents settled in Dundalk, which is a kind of factory town, when my parents settled there, I say my parents settled, my younger siblings thought that's where they lived. And I always thought, well, how long will we be here? Where will we go next? And when are we going home? And so I think I have this feeling of attachment to not village life, but the connection between the street and between the street and the landscape. Between being in a street and seeing a mountain at the end of a street. If you just turn me off and turn me on again, I think that's what I see in my mind's eye is a view down the street with a hill at the end of it, or with a rising hill. I remember driving across Ireland once with my late but great friend Kevin Kieran, who I was very close to. And as we were driving along, I kept pointing out something to Kevin. And when we arrived, after a long drive, Kevin said, "John, you've only pointed out one kind of landscape since we left town. It's always the same." And so I realized that somehow that rolling folding landscape of the Irish countryside and a view of it through a gap is somehow locked in my memory.
And I guess another recurring preoccupation inevitably in one's childhood is the nature of institutions that you're kind of ferried between. I remember having a conversation once with Tom Emerson from 6A about we were staying at the time in Oxford at Stirling's Florey building. Stirling, obviously, an architect who features quite prominently very prominently in your life and in this narrative. And Tom, made the observation, which feels plausible to me, that Stirling was an architect who felt in his younger days profound sense of discomfort with institutions, and the later work suggests a more comfortable relationship. I wondered, how some of the school life that you described was clearly not always a happy one, and there's a sort of bristling relationship even to UCD, I think, when you're a student at University College Dublin. Could you talk a little about how those experiences have kind of shaped you've made buildings for multiple institutions,
including schools, and I do have a really strong memory. Maybe we all have memory of the time when you step out of the household, the home base, and you go to school. And I can remember, events around the beginnings and ends of school days. And I had one amazing time on that. We lived in Cooley in the northern part of Ireland, in a very rural place. And I went to a very old-fashioned school. And you went up on outside stairs and in a door and into a shared classroom with two classes facing in opposite directions, teachers at each end of the room, and and a lot of interaction between different age groups in that school. And then amazingly, in my second year in that school, we all gathered outside the school on the day it was demolished, and and then we walked in a kind of crocodile from the demolition site down the road to our new school, which is a typology of schools that's very much in my mind. In fact, it may have been the motivation that made me join the Office of Public Works when I was young, that I thought I could make that kind of type made out of elements, water tower, play structure, high classrooms, that kind of categorization of space. When I was 8, if you like, I walked into that as a completely new type of building to me and to everyone I knew. And I have a very strong attachment to that. If I'm thinking village street and mountain at the end, I'm definitely thinking those kinds of buildings where the parts of the building are shown for what they are: classrooms with high ceilings, offices with low flat roofs, low walls with stiles that you step over, towers for the water, structures for play, a kind of space matrix that made up out of parts. And it's true that in the early buildings that I made, I was always trying to disaggregate them into those kind of, I mean, the very, very first thing I ever did in the Office of Public Works, a laboratory, really looks like one of those national schools, you know, it really does. I mean, there's hardly anything else in it. And so it's true that you don't know this at the time, but the spaces that the organisms that you interact with become lodged in your mind, you know, and then you're manipulating those. It's a limited vocabulary, but definitely there's an impact. Yeah.
John, the description of your, there's just fantastic descriptions of the Dublin of your student days at UCD, and with this kind of range of influences and experiences that are quite alien to the world that you maybe grew up in, you know, of internet European cinema particularly. It kind of features kind of prominently, and I guess the student activism that you're kind of, you know, involved in, kind of campaigning against the demolition of elements of the Georgian city, and at the same time kind of looking at very intently at Russian constructivism in the library, quite a kind of strange kind of melange of different sort of enthusiasms. I guess, but one wonders if was the part of the attraction for the Russian constructivism for you, the kind of explicitly politicized.
Oh, for sure. You know, I had the feeling that, you know, the purpose of doing architecture was, you know, to change the world, and if you weren't doing that, you were doing it wrong. You know, I mean, I was quite adamant about that, about being an activist architect, if you know what I mean. But through architecture, and then I realized, I think after a while, that the aesthetics of it were really a big motivation for me. You know, I wasn't going to let go of the form, and so I had to re-examine, you know, my own commitments, if you like, because I wasn't going to go down the road of moving away from institutions, or moving away from design. You know, I needed. I mean, my arrival in UCD at the age of 17 was like, just put all my school days behind me. I've found where I belong. You know, it was just that moment of almost like first week in the architecture studio. I thought, I'm here, and actually I haven't really left that world ever since, you know. But at the beginning, I had the idea that the purpose of it is to wipe the slate clean and start again. and the constructivists were so inspiring. I mean, but you know, but also they're, I mean, graphically so inspiring, you know. And we had a brilliant introduction to architectural education in our first year, which was kind of unknown to us, because Shane de Blackham had just come back from Louis Kahn's office, and it was his first year teaching. But he didn't talk to us about Louis Kahn. And anyway, I was 17, you know, I didn't know anything about anything like that. But we just got this fundamentalist kind of start from the beginnings, you know, clear the table, think from the start, introduction in first year. And then I have to say, after that, there wasn't very much going on, you know, that would inspire you. So I more or less, you know, diagrammatically, I was in the studio in first year, and then I was in the library for the rest of my college career. But I fell in with a crowd of people from the College of Art, and through student activities, you know, I was in the Student Architectural Society, and I met people from the Art College, and we were all a bit, I'd say, politicized around the issue of the city and around the issue of education, access to education. So quite quickly, I was sort of on the street, you know, and all that, you know, this feeling that students have a role remember, this is early 70s, so it's post 1968, and you have an idea in your head about what a student is meant to be. And it's an amazing period of, it's 5 years, and I didn't have a year out or anything. So it's a period of kind of just, is it kind of irresponsible or extreme responsibility, feeling that you have to think it out for yourself and start it out for yourself. I think it was formative for me, my time at UCD. Yeah, but not so much. I don't mean to say that I was well taught or learned a lot. It was more like what was happening around, the college was right opposite the Irish Film Theatre. So it was a great program of European cinema. And I came from, provincial Ireland, and I had no knowledge of that kind of art cinema world. So I got totally caught up in that. And also the world of visual art through my art college friends, that I got very interested in what it takes to make a work of art. So I'd say there was a parallel education outside UCD that was going on, and through activism, through reading, through immersion and freedom. Actually, I don't think I wouldn't have a very good student portfolio, Ellis. You'd be disappointed.
Was that the case for Sheila as well, or did she was a better student?
Sheila's extremely meticulous person. Does beautiful drawings.
It takes you. I mean, you obviously you meet Sheila kind of very early on at UCD, and it takes you, the two of you, a little while to figure out that you're destined for each other. But there's a sort of 5-year out period. But I mean, did she have? She must have had other experiences and enthusiasms that were influential on you at this point too.
Well, I mean, the big difference, apart from the obvious difference, the big difference between me and Sheila when we met is her parents are, her father is university professor, dean of university, potential president of the university, if you like. And she grew up here in Dublin 6, in leafy Dublin, in the academic surroundings. And so I was, came from a totally different background. I mean, actually, both our parents are engineers, father's engineers and all that, but my social background, if you like, the place I'd come from was not sophisticated city life. So sure, I couldn't believe when I met her first how much she had read, and then she said to me, well, we read all that in school, that was on the course. And I thought, oh, you mean I discovered that my English teacher in my school had made a decision on his own that novels were wasted on boys. And I remember going into my Leaving Cert examination, which is the final thing in school, and thinking, that's a bit unfair asking you about books. It's a bit random. How would you know if what happens in 1984 or Animal Farm? And how would you know that? I might have read that, but we just had such a narrow education, if you can call it that, in school. And Sheila was so widely read, and she had been reading existentialism when she was 15. But she was just a better educated person.
And so you both can separately find your way to London, which I guess the narrative is very much of the book is very much about a movement, successive movements to a larger world in a way in the first half of the book. I mean, one thing you don't particularly talk about in the book, but I was intrigued by was, just the experience of being Irish in London in the 70s, at the height of the Troubles. Was there explicit racism that you sort of encountered kind of in London, or were you greeted with?
I have heard so many people speaking about that, but in the world I was in, which is only the architectural world, I think it was the opposite. I mean, I think we were slightly favored by the people, by employers and mentors, because I think that they viewed us as coming from a particular place. Now, remember that Dublin had a strong educational, pedagogical connection with the British scene. We were boiled in the British scene. by the not when I was in college, but just before my time, there had been this flying circus of tutors from London coming and Scotland coming to teach in Dublin in a kind of interregnum, brilliant period, but I missed it. But when I came to London, there was a big body of goodwill towards the Dublin school. And I don't think I ever met anything except encouragement to make use out of that somehow. So I think it depends on where you are. But if you go back to my earlier, when I came as a student, like when I came when I was 18 or something, and worked in factories and did non-architectural work, I still think that there was a big distinction drawn between my generation and, say, 20 years before that, when the Irish, were digging the roads and laying the railways, and the Irish navvy kind of lonely life tradition. And it's true. I should have discussed that in the book, that when I came to stay in digs and in short stay places in my first few years in London, like I'd be staying somewhere like Kilburn or North London, somewhere Kentish Town, often in close adjacency to men who were 20, 30 years older than me, who you'd meet in factories or you'd meet in bars. And the culture difference between me and them is much more than the culture difference between me and my generation in London. It's like they had a feeling that there was no return to Ireland. They were lost in London, if you know what I mean, displaced. And I think I always had the feeling that just the luck of my generation is that we had mobility.
And knowing that you were going to go back, or
go anywhere. Kind of a European commitment. I mean, don't forget that Ireland was gradually working its way towards joining the European Union, and I mean, I think, my book ends at more or less at the point of catharsis. When Mary Robinson got elected in 1991, and Ireland, it's impossible not to see the importance of that release into sort of freedom that comes in Irish mentality for being part of Europe. I mean, remember, joining Europe gets over the whole post-colonial problem, in your psyche. So I think we were that generation that was going towards that, and I didn't feel restricted at all. And remember, I'm from the Republic, not from the North. It would be different if you were from the North.
Yes, of course. And I mean, in London, like, you have these incredible encounters with, particularly with Sterling's office, which you kind of join at this very. I hadn't, until I read it in the book, I hadn't in my head that there'd been this sort of 7-year period when he actually hadn't had any commissions until we were winning the Starts Gallery, which you worked on the competition entries for. And I mean, Sterling, I guess, sort of embodied an idea of what an architect was, with a very high level of authorship that was also available in your context with the Architectural Association. But perhaps there were fewer models in Ireland at the time of that kind of a practice.
For sure. I mean, I think we felt no. We had no uncles, if you like, in Ireland in architecture. Nobody, no mentors, no heroes. We felt our outlook was outwards, and including, I mean, I have to say that we had a very strong feeling of connection with what you call British brutalism. Maybe coming from reading in the library. I mean, the books I was reading when I was in my 3rd and 4th year in college and my final year in college were all about British post-war architecture and Russian constructivism, and the kind of the idea of building a new society, through architecture, which, your culture was extremely strong, had an extremely strong stance about what an architect was for, I think. And when I came to London, I discovered that I was like, 10 years out of date. I've been reading magazines that were, I mean, the city had moved on, So I was a kind of like, when I joined Starling's office, I was the only person in that office who had seen all the early buildings, except for Sterling, of course. But nobody there was going to spending their weekends going to see the Florey or going up to Leicester, or but I had seen all those, but I had seen everything that he had done by the time I joined his office. But I was amazed that nobody else in the office had been to see those things, and none of the new intake.
It's interesting that attachment you have to that earlier period, that because I sense a slightly, you and Sheila both had a somewhat skeptical relationship to the emerging kind of postmodern discourse.
Yeah.
You're in Sterling's office. I mean, I think Sterling himself had that sort of. He wasn't entirely comfortable with being pigeonholed as part of that movement. I mean, it's obvious that there are aspects of that discourse, I guess, particularly in relation to the kind of work you did with Group 91 later about the reuse of existing fabric and the seriousness with which you view the existing city that feel like a product of ideas that were in the air in the 70s, but you also had this sort of resistance to postmodern classicism, I think, as it was emerging.
I think we were. I mean, I think we were both really turned off by that, because we had this idea that the engine should work. The engine of a building should work from its entirety. The entire organism of the building should work like an and I mean, that's obviously comes from all the stuff we've been doing when we were students. Not that we were good at, but that we had read a lot about. So this sort of surface applique, was shocking to us, I think. And we felt we had to get away from it. I mean, London did dive into that for a short period of its architecture culture. And at the beginning, it's exciting because people were talking about how to look at historical buildings, but that's not what we were interested in. We weren't thinking about the appearance of things, I think. So yeah, we probably had a bit of a moral, a moral eye, moralizing eye, which kept us out of that. Yeah, including with Sterling. I mean, I'd say to Sterling, do you not think there's enough? Is there not enough stone in this building already? What? I loved Stuttgart when it was in the volumes of its structure. I loved it, and I was afraid that he was over buttering it, with stone. But he was fine, because you could talk to him about things like that. He wouldn't fire you for that kind of comment.
I mean, yes, because of course, I mean, the vocabulary of that building is somewhat been rehearsed in earlier competition entries, but it must have been to see the built reality of that building in its coloured stone must have been a shock.
Including to him. I mean, I remember, because I finished in the office, in 81 or 80, and Sheila worked there for a year, so she didn't work on the Stuttgart. But we got married in 1984. Sheila and I got married, and we went to Venice on our honeymoon, and it coincided with the opening of Stuttgart, and so we took a train up to meet Jim in Stuttgart, and we had a little party just to celebrate the opening of the building. And walking around with him, he also was kind of taken aback at how much people liked it, and it actually bothered him. He said, "Something wrong with it. Something wrong with it, isn't it? It can't be liked like this." People were stopping him in the street and saying how at home they felt in the building. And he's saying, "Wow, doesn't feel normal."
And so when you head back, the two of you, to Dublin, and you initially joining the Office for Public Works, and you're very candid about looking back at some of those projects you did then when you didn't have the formal confidence, particularly around the external experience of the buildings that you'd acquire kind of later. but it's and then there's this kind of leap towards private practice, and of a kind that must have felt like a quite a risk at that time. I mean, the opportunities for architecture were you kind of had to invent in a way, you know, particularly through the.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I mean, we started our practice in the late 80s, and I mean, there was no work at all. And I mean, the thrill was getting a room with your own desk and, you know, a telephone, and yeah, it was a pioneering, but thrill. Yeah, that's right. But remember, we were also teaching a little bit. Maybe that kept us, at least that paid for food. But it was a great moment. I remember do you remember the fax machine when it came out first? And I was teaching in America, and I would make a sketch, you know, at my desk and put the sketch in the fax machine. And then Sheila would go down to a print shop around the corner. You know, I'd phone her and say, I've sent a fax. She would go down a print shop around the corner, snap instant print, collect the 4 pages of fax, bring it back to the office, and then phone me with the pages in front of her. And we both thought this was like the future. You know, can you imagine, you know, that we can exchange sketches so simply? And then, so we bought a fax machine, you know, in almost the first purchase. And I think we were almost the first architect's office in Dublin with no work at all, but we bought a fax machine. And a guy came in to maintain the machine after about 3 months and asked us how it was going. And in those days, you paid for it by the amount of paper that you rolled out, you know, that rolled out of the machine. And he said, how is it going? We said, oh, it's going really well. We're really happy with it. We're totally committed to it. And he said, oh yeah, how much paper have you used? And I said, oh, I don't know, I mean, 30, 40. And he said, 30, 40 rolls. And I said, no, 30, 40 sheets of paper. So, I mean, in 3 months, we had, you know, used a fraction of the, you know, we had used like 30 A4 sheets of paper. And we thought this was the best thing in the world. So
fantastic.
There's a novelty about how setting up your practice with, I mean, and then we had a son that I remember you met James when he was very young, but he had a box underneath Sheila's desk, you know, that he was his playpen. You know, the studio became home in a way, you know, and we had our fax machine, and I'm just looking for it. I had Giancarlo De Carlo gave me his pencil sharpener, you know. So I had my pencil sharpener, my fax machine, and all you needed then was a project. I mean, that took a while. Yeah.
I remember James Gowan when he was in his last years and had work in Italy, and all the drawings had to be A4 so that they could be faxed. James would draw these beautiful axonometrics, which were the working method. And I guess just to kind of bring it to a conclusion, I mean, Group 91 feel and the reconstruction, the saving of Temple Bar feels like the great moment when the practice really begins and opportunities to do public work kind of emerge.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, in our particular case, that we got the commission for the Irish Film Centre, which predates all that Temple Bar stuff, and we had done a number of feasibilities for I mean, we kind of helped write the brief, and we knew a lot of people who were involved in film culture from our student film society days and our art college days. So we knew a lot of, you know, we knew some of those people, and we helped sort of conceptualize this, what's now called a culture cluster, you know, where archive, education, projection, and discussion and bookshop, you know, would come together to make what's called a culture center, if you like. And we helped develop that concept, and then we looked for sites for that and made feasibilities for a number of places around Dublin. And then when eventually they bought the Quaker meeting house in what became Temple Bar, we were in from the very beginning with that, and in a way that's what started our practice. So by the time we won, by the time collectively we won Temple Bar regeneration, we were already on site with the kind of, our career in that arena had already started. And actually the question we were asking ourselves is, what can we do beyond this? Because remember, I spent 10 years working one block in Temple Bar, because we did 3 buildings connected with each other. And the feeling was one of limitation rather than, because something else had to break, if you like. So then we just shortly after the book, just beyond the boundaries of this book, we won this competition in the north of Ireland for a golf centre, a landscape project. And actually that was a huge breakthrough, because it got us out into, first of all, out into the landscape, but also out beyond the confines of the limits of those streets. So I think for us, the 1989, 1990, when we started the film center and started this little pavilion for paintings, that's our catapult moment. That's when the world caught fire for us. Yeah,
in reading the book, one senses that your early student activism work, that is the foundation of the kind of practice that you developed, particularly through the Temple Bar project. And maybe also I can imagine when you were right about being street cleaner in Covent Garden in your early days in London, at a time when Brian Anson was campaigning to kind of save Covent Garden. So there were kind of, I'm sure that these sort of experiences must have informed the whole Temple Bar story.
When I was in the Architecture Society in college, I invited Brian Anson to come speak to us in Dublin. And I went to the head of school and I said, we're inviting Brian Anson. And he refused to fund the thing because he thought he was, antagonistic, to the culture of art, to the practice of architecture. And I remember I had to go out and fund it myself, get people to fund just his travel expenses. Brian Anson didn't charge anything. But I remember that feeling of stepping out and saying, well, hell, I'm bringing him anyway, and he had a great, we really benefited from that wider questioning of what's a building for, and how do buildings work in society, and how does society use its space. And I think that turning your back on the narrow brief and looking at the social situation had a huge effect on my expectation for what architecture can do. Yeah.
And these feel such resonant topics today, I think, for an emerging generation. You teach, you've got a distinguished experience as a teacher. Do you sense do you sense that a kind of return to kind of some of the preoccupations that were very alive in architectural culture?
Isn't it a first question, that like, how can I be useful here? Which is different than how do you serve? It's how can I actually be useful, or how can I bring something useful to this? I always felt that architects should be able to, the traffic accident where people gather around and somebody comes up and says, all right, I'm a doctor, and people, I think architects should be able to approach with this feeling that they can bring something, a strategic thing, not just here's a building contract, but the architect should be able to carry some kind of authority out of wanting to be useful. I haven't changed in that opinion.
Final question, John. Did you find things out in the course of writing it? Were there the kind of realizations you had, or is this a story that you kind of felt you had fully packaged before you set finger to typewriter?
I set out with the idea of a place based recollection. That was what I thought I was doing. You know, that I was going to write about the places that still live in my mind, including the ones that I've kind of made up in my mind out of the things that I half remember. You know, I knew that I was going to do that. I hadn't expected my father to keep coming into the picture. My father is 12 years dead now, and you know, I had the feeling when I was young that you know, I had this fledgling feeling that you grow up in a nest, and then you fly the nest and you leave it all behind you. You know, that's when I came to college, I just thought, well, that's over now. You know, and now I'm free. But it's funny when you come to write your memories of your childhood, how especially in my case, I think that I hadn't really begun to talk to myself about how influential my father had been on my formation. And that's, you know, that's, I think actually probably after my father died, I mean, he was very kind of intelligent and intellectually minded person. But he had a slow death because he got confusion of mind, you know, eventually. You were kind of waiting for him to die, if you know what I mean, to let go. But my relationship with him improved a lot after he died. We got on, you know, we get on a lot better. I mean, he didn't do that much talking anyway. So I found the book very helpful, which is a surprise to me. Just personally, I found it helpful to kind of recall and consider the formative influence of my father. You know.
Yeah, those passages I found particularly moving, and you're incredibly candid, but also sympathetic and empathetic about what the situations that might have formed him. John, huge congratulations. I think it's a great achievement, and one gets to the end and one does want more, but at the same time, I think you're quite explicit that this is as far as the story goes. But I very much hope the experience has made you want to write other long form things, because the writing is just beautiful. Congratulations.
Thank you, Ellis. Thank you very much. Thank you.